Hello and welcome to the third video in this series making simple Flappy Robin for the iPhone and iPad using Cocos2d. So this video then, after the last video explained a little bit about high definition and normal definition graphics, will be a fairly simple video. We want to add the sort of the background, the blue sky and the floor to our application before we do anything more complicated. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to add it inside the intro scene. And before we do that, what I want to do is I want to actually delete the Hello World scene completely. So select both of these files here and just delete them because we don't need it anymore. And that means inside the app.delegate.m we can remove this reference to that scene. And that also means that inside intro scene.m at the top we can also remove this reference. Next, I'd like to remove these two lines here that create this color. And also this label here, we don't need this label anymore, and we don't need this button anymore either. So your initialization should look like this. And then down the bottom here, this spinning clicked, we don't need this anymore because it's not going to be doing anything for us, that function. And that leaves us then in a state to start adding our own things into the program. Well, the first thing we want to do is actually add some resources into there. I'll just find the resources here, and I've prepared some resources already. We have the floor for the iPad HD, basically the four variants I spoke about in the last video we have for the floor and also for the main background. So I'm just going to drag and drop those into the resources and copy like we did before. And in preparation for this video I should note I've already deleted out the Robin images from the previous video. They'll go back in at some point, but for now I wanted to take them out and start from a clean state. So we have our main background and our floor now inside, and now we can get on with actually adding those onto the scene. Now before we do that here, one thing we need to think about is when we add a sprite onto a scene or anything, or a label or anything, we can give it what's called a Z order, because you won't have seen in the last video, but if I add a sprite inside init here, so say here I do add sprite, and then I add another sprite here in the same place. This sprite, the second one that's spelt badly, will appear on top of this first one. And the reason is because it's been added afterwards. However, what you can also do is determine what's on top of the other by giving it what's called a Z index. And the higher the Z index, the more near the front, so to your vision, it appears. So if I'd given this sprite a Z index of 6 and this one a Z index of 3, then the one with 6 would appear on top of the one with 3. If the Z index is the same, like I said, it depends on what order they've been added onto the layer. So the floor will need to appear on top of the background, but also later on in the app that some of the tubes and the mountains will actually be behind the floor but in front of the background. So we'll need some Z indexes. And with any kind of numbers or anything, usually it's a good idea to have them as constants inside the program. So I've right-clicked on classes and gone for new file. I want to make a new header file. I'm going to call this new header file constantsh. Make sure that the target's selected and hit create. And now inside constantsh, just want to define a couple of constants. So we'll say k, z index and bg. For the background is 0. And we'll also define then k, z index. God, who can't spell today? K, Z index, and then floor, and we'll put this as 40 for now. So it gives us some room to put things in between later on, and just save that file. At the top of intro scene.m then, I just want to import then this header constants.h. And I have this familiar problem that I've had before, where it doesn't seem to want to find the file. I'm just going to hit build and see if everything builds and maybe the indexing fixes itself. Yes, it has. Good. Okay. So that's constants and imported. We can now use those Z indexes. So going down into the initialization here, then let's actually get our background on. So cc sprite, we'll just call it bg sprite for now, for background sprite. And throughout the application, these sprites stay completely fixed on this screen. So we don't need them as a member variable of the class or anything. We simply need to add them here. So we have csprite and then sprite with image named, and then we want here to use the main bg.png, remembering that the suffixes are there for the right one to be chosen. And then we want the position type, so we say .position type equals and cc position type normalized. And then, sorry about the dog barking in the background, then the position itself then is equal to cpp, and then we want 0.5 by 0.5 to stick it in the middle of the screen. And last but not least, we want self and add child and the bg sprite, and we want this time with a z index of the k z index background. So it's also with the z index. Okay, so if I just run the application here and just check that we indeed do have a blue background, and I just drag it across here, and you can see that we have a nice blue background. So the next thing to do is to add the floors. So I'm just going to take the floor, take that copy code for the bg sprite and just change this into floor sprite, and quickly copy this in here, and also change the name here. And the floor's going on the bottom, so we want the y actually to be a 0 here, because we don't want to go halfway up the screen, we want to stay on the bottom. And our z index here should be now the z index of the floor. So if I now run the application again on the Retina iPhone, we can see the floor appear. And the thing you may notice about this is the floor is very small and thin. And if we look at the actual image of the floor, you can see that proportionally it's thicker than what has appeared on the application. Well, the reason for that is something called the anchor point of a sprite. So let's run the application again, and if we just imagine that this whole window is a sprite, and hopefully you can see the mouse cursor okay, the sprite has a number of pixels. In the case of the window, 0 by 0 down the bottom left, going 960 to the right and 640 upwards. So when we then say we want to put our sprite at position 10 by 10, which 10 by 10 is 1 pixel point, well, how does the program know which part of the sprite to position at 10 by 10? And this is what we set using what's called an anchor point. And by default that's set at 0.5 by 0.5. And that means the anchor point is halfway along the sprite and halfway up. So we position all sprites by the pixel that's in the middle of the sprite. So we've positioned our floor at 0.5 by 0, 0 in its normalization, which means we've said we want to put the floor on the bottom, so at 0, and we want to put it halfway along, and we know it's the width of the screen, so the width is correct. But because we haven't changed the anchor point of the floor, it's positioning on the bottom of the screen the middle of the floor sprite, so we only see half of it visible, the other half is off the bottom of the screen. So we actually need to make the anchor point for the y direction a 0, so that for the position of where the sprite goes, it positions the bottom of the sprite at that relevant position, which has the effect of shifting it up. So what we'll actually say then is floor sprite dot anchor point equals ccp, and then we still want 0.5 with the x because we want halfway along the floor sprite as the bit that we're positioning, but then we actually want 0.0 for the y, so that at the bottom of the screen here we take the bottom part in terms of the y of the floor sprite. So if I just run that again, you'll see now that the floor appears on the application much thicker than it did before. So that's all now working okay. One check we can quickly do is to run this on the iPad, a standard iPad, so a non-Retina iPad, and the application starts, and you can see everything is also looking fine and the proportion of the floor is correct. And there's one problem with this though, and that'll be if we run this as an iPhone 5. So if I go to the iPhone 4-inch, and now we've got the problem as expected that we have the black borders around because our images aren't wide enough for the device. We'll deal with this problem in the next video because we're going to need to deal with, throughout the application, we want the speed of the tubes or when you play the app, it looks like the speed of the robin flying, but the speed of the things, we want that to be constant whatever device we're playing on, iPad or iPhone. So we need some way of scaling certain positions and parameters between the two. And also where we position things on the screen, we need to shift those maybe to the right or to the left into the middle more if we've got an iPhone 5. And in some cases, like with the background and the floor, we need to actually stretch them in the X direction so they fill the whole screen. And the way we'll do that though is, as you'll see in the next video, to introduce a game manager class, which will be what's called a singleton. I'll explain that in the next video. And that will then keep, when the application starts up, it'll save the relevant information and will then scale our sprites appropriately. But we'll start looking at that in the next video and how we deal with the iPhone 5 and the different devices. So I hope this video made a little bit of sense. We've actually started the application. We've got a nice sky and a floor. And see you in the next one. Comments, questions, criticisms welcome as always on YouTube.